The vast, unforgiving terrain of Greenland stretched out in every direction, a landscape defined by snow and ice. A dark, unbroken expanse of tundra met the horizon where jagged mountain peaks cut through the sky. The wind howled across the surface, carrying with it the biting chill of a frozen world, where even the air seemed thick with the weight of isolation. The sun, a pale shadow in the sky, offered little warmth as it skimmed the horizon, casting long, hollow shadows that stretched far beyond the land's edges. Greenland, for all its vastness and beauty, was a land of extremes. Here, the earth was scarred by glaciers that moved like slow rivers of ice, carving out deep fjords and valleys. The snow, deep and unyielding, covered the land in a blanket of white, turning every ridge and crevice into a potential hazard. The temperature in the winter months could plummet to dangerously low levels, and the wind, always present, cut through the environment like a blade. For anyone unprepared, this place was capable of swiftly erasing any trace of humanity, of rendering even the most determined of travelers invisible. For the men of the U.S. Army Rangers, this was their new home. For the duration of their mission, they had been sent to Greenland, part of a larger strategic operation during World War II, with little more than their training and determination to rely on. Their mission, to set up a base of operations and gain a foothold in this isolated, frigid corner of the world, was vital to the war effort. They were told little else, their task being simple: survive the elements and execute their orders. Their arrival was marked by a muted sense of uncertainty. The Rangers unloaded from their transport aircraft, each one stepping out onto the cold, hard surface of Greenland, with the quiet acknowledgement of the difficulty of what lay ahead. There were no signs of life, no welcoming party, no infrastructure to rely on. Only the ice, the snow, and the endless expanse of land that seemed to go on forever. The Rangers, prepared for hardship, were already facing the first obstacle of their mission, the environment itself. With no immediate threats, they began their work, setting up tents, establishing a small outpost. Their equipment, though designed for rough conditions, was tested immediately by the extreme cold and the relentless winds. The landscape seemed indifferent to their efforts, the silence broken only by the occasional creaking of ice or the whistling wind. There was no shelter from the elements, only the harsh beauty of the land, both captivating and ominous in its solitude. The Rangers, isolated in this frozen world, had yet to understand the true severity of their situation. Though they were trained for survival, nothing could fully prepare them for what the land would demand. The first days passed quietly, their focus on setting up a foothold, unknowingly embarking on what would become one of the most testing experiences of their lives. The U.S. Army Rangers, elite soldiers trained for the most demanding of tasks, had been assembled for a mission that would test not only their physical endurance but their mental fortitude. Comprised of men selected for their strength, discipline, and ability to thrive under extreme conditions, they were sent to Greenland in 1941 under the direction of the U.S. The mission, part of the larger Allied strategy during World War II, aimed to establish a strategic presence in the Arctic, a region of vital importance due to its proximity to Europe and its potential as a base for future operations. The Rangers who arrived in Greenland were not strangers to hardship. Their training had taken them through some of the harshest environments on Earth, from the mountains of the Pacific Northwest to the dense forests of the eastern United States. They were taught to survive with minimal resources, to adapt to whatever conditions they might encounter, and to remain calm under pressure. But even the most experienced soldiers could not have fully anticipated the brutality of Greenland's frozen landscape. The mission was part of a broader effort to secure Arctic territories, a region that had long been a strategic area of interest. Greenland, with its isolated nature and rugged terrain, was an ideal location for an airbase that could be used to launch attacks on German forces occupying northern Europe. The U.S. military's objective was clear: establish a presence in Greenland, set up necessary infrastructure, and prepare for future operations. The team of Rangers, led by a seasoned commander, understood the gravity of their task. They were not there for a simple training exercise, but for a mission that could alter the course of the war. The stakes were high. Their arrival was just the beginning. While they had come with a sense of purpose, the reality of the environment began to set in quickly. As they set up camp and unpacked their gear, they realized that Greenland's challenges were unlike anything they had trained for. The temperatures would drop far below freezing, and the winds could whip across the icy surface, creating whiteout conditions and making navigation nearly impossible. Yet, the Rangers pressed on, determined to fulfill their mission. They built temporary shelters, set up a rudimentary communication system, and began to plan their next steps. The landscape, barren and silent, was both their greatest adversary and their most formidable ally. It was a land of contradictions, stunningly beautiful, yet dangerously hostile. The sense of isolation grew stronger with each passing day. Though the Rangers were a group of capable men, the loneliness of the Arctic began to seep in. The hours were long, and the tasks, basic as they seemed, were exhausting. Setting up their camp was only the first challenge. Their survival depended on their ability to work together, to trust in their training, and to rely on their resourcefulness. At this stage, the Rangers had yet to face true danger. The cold was biting, the winds unforgiving, but they were still in control of their situation. The mission was progressing, but they had no idea what lay ahead. As they completed their preparations, the realization slowly dawned: their survival was not guaranteed. Greenland had already begun to make its presence felt. It did not take long for the Rangers to realize that their mission, while seemingly straightforward, would present far greater challenges than anticipated. The extreme cold of Greenland began to take its toll on both their equipment and their bodies. What had initially been a mere inconvenience soon became a formidable obstacle. The harsh environment did not offer the luxury of preparation or adaptation. It was immediate, unforgiving, and relentless. The first sign of trouble came as the temperatures dropped, lower than the Rangers had ever experienced. Even with their high-quality gear, the cold seeped through their layers of clothing and insulation. Frostbite became a real concern, and what seemed like a manageable cold snap soon turned into a battle for survival against the elements. No matter how many layers of clothing the Rangers wore, their extremities would go numb, and the deep chill would gnaw at their bones. The cold seemed to exist, not only in the air, but in the ground beneath them, the frozen soil exuding a bitterness that made every step heavier than the last. The Rangers had been trained to endure, but they had not prepared for the unrelenting nature of Greenland's weather. It was not just the temperatures that were difficult to manage, but the wind. The constant howling gusts were like invisible forces pushing against them. Even the simplest tasks, like setting up tents or securing gear, became exponentially more difficult as the wind kicked up snow, turning the landscape into a near-impossible maze. Visibility was often reduced to mere feet, and the feeling of isolation grew with each passing hour. The team's spirits remained relatively high at first, despite the cold. They had come to expect hardship after all, and the familiar sense of camaraderie helped to maintain morale. Yet, there was an underlying sense of tension building, an awareness that something was amiss. The Rangers were not yet in a true survival situation, but the dangers of their environment were becoming undeniable. Their decision to push forward with the mission now seemed more precarious. Supplies began to dwindle faster than anticipated due to the increased difficulty in managing them under the harsh conditions. The food reserves, carefully packed for the journey, were slowly being used up, and each meal became a reminder of the fragility of their situation. The isolation they had initially accepted as part of the mission was starting to feel like an inescapable reality, and the idea of rescue, of returning to the warmth and safety of civilization, seemed increasingly distant. It was not a single event, but the cumulative weight of these challenges that began to create a sense of unease. The rangers could feel the situation shifting. The environment was not simply something to endure, it was actively shaping their experience. Every decision, every action now carried consequences. The cold, the wind, the isolation, they were all constant reminders that Greenland was a world unto itself, one that did not yield easily to human will. The first real sign of danger had not yet arrived, but the rangers were beginning to understand that the greatest threat would not come in the form of a sudden storm or a quick violent incident. It was the slow grinding pressure of the environment itself. They had underestimated it, and the land was beginning to reveal just how much it could take from them. As the days wore on, the reality of surviving in Greenland became increasingly apparent to the rangers. With each passing hour, the extreme cold settled deeper into their bones, and the demands of the environment began to shape their daily routines. The harshness of the land required a constant effort to adapt, as the rangers' survival depended on their ability to manage their limited resources and withstand the brutal conditions that defined their existence. The rangers' first priority was shelter. The harsh wind and freezing temperatures left no room for error when it came to setting up camp. The tents, designed to withstand cold but not built for the extreme conditions they now faced, were constantly battered by the wind. Though the soldiers took every precaution, ensuring that the tents were anchored tightly to the ground, there were moments when the wind howled so violently that it seemed as though the very ground beneath them would be torn away. The rangers had to adapt, reinforcing their shelters and finding creative ways to ensure they were not overwhelmed by the elements. Inside the tents, the cold was inescapable. Even with stoves and fire barrels, warmth was fleeting, and the temperature never truly rose to a comfortable level. The rangers huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the air as they went about their tasks. Despite their best efforts, frost would form on the inside of their tents, and ice would build up on the edges of their gear. Clothing became damp from condensation, further draining the rangers' energy as they struggled to stay warm and dry. Food, too, was a constant challenge. The rangers had been issued rations designed for military expeditions, but these supplies quickly became insufficient as the days stretched on. Preparing meals was labor-intensive, requiring careful rationing and creative methods to conserve what little they had. Some of the more experienced rangers hunted the sparse wildlife, though the frozen landscape made it difficult to find enough food to keep everyone nourished. For the most part, their diet consisted of freeze-dried meals, which offered minimal sustenance and little comfort. The cold made it difficult to even enjoy food, as each meal became a chore rather than a source of comfort. Discipline, already ingrained in the rangers' training, became essential for maintaining their routine. Every task, no matter how small, had to be completed with precision and efficiency. They worked in shifts to ensure that everyone had a role, whether it was maintaining the shelter, preparing food, or keeping watch for potential dangers. Sleep was fitful at best, as the constant cold made it difficult to find any real rest. The rangers' bodies, exhausted by the harsh conditions, longed for warmth and relief, but they had learned quickly that neither would come easily. Despite the unrelenting conditions, the rangers remained focused on their mission. Their background and training had prepared them for this kind of hardship, but as the days passed, it became clear that Greenland was testing their limits. The landscape seemed to press in on them, its cold, expansive nature turning each day into an ordeal of endurance. They had prepared for a mission of great importance, but they had not anticipated the toll it would take on their bodies and minds. The cold became not just an external force, but an internal one, wearing them down piece by piece. As the days continued, the rangers found themselves forced into a rhythm that revolved around survival. Each day was an effort to maintain their position and ensure that they could endure the next. There were no moments of respite, no reprieves from the ever-present cold. The world outside their shelters was a silent, frozen wasteland, unchanging and indifferent to their presence. It was in this isolation, with nothing to distract them from their own thoughts and struggles, that the true nature of their mission began to take shape. They were not just fighting against the elements, they were fighting against time itself. The daily routine became a matter of discipline. They would wake in the cold morning, set about their tasks, and face the same challenges again and again. Food, warmth, shelter, these were the priorities, and each day was a small victory in their ongoing struggle for survival. Yet, in the back of their minds, the Rangers knew that time was not on their side. The longer they remained in Greenland, the more their situation would deteriorate. They had come for a mission, but as the cold seeped deeper into their bones, it was clear that their survival would be the real test of their strength and resolve. As the days blurred together under the constant assault of cold, the true psychological toll of Greenland's isolation began to show. While the Rangers had trained for physical endurance, nothing could have prepared them for the slow, unyielding pressure of time spent in such an unforgiving place. The isolation, compounded by the environment's harshness, worked on them in ways both seen and unseen, fracturing their resolve bit by bit. Physically, they were feeling the strain. The cold, combined with the exhaustion of constant labor, wore on their bodies. Muscles that had once been resilient now ached from the cold and constant use. Even the simplest tasks, hauling supplies, maintaining the shelters, or preparing food, became a challenge. Frostbite began to show on fingers and toes, despite the Rangers' efforts to keep warm. In such cold, circulation was easily compromised, and small wounds or minor injuries became serious problems. The ice, which had once seemed like a stable part of the landscape, now posed a threat to their well-being. Food, which had once been rationed cautiously, was now scarce. The Rangers had to become even more creative, foraging for what they could in the barren landscape. Though there was the occasional success in hunting, it was never enough to fill their stomachs for long. The freeze-dried rations, while still available, were losing their ability to sustain the men for long stretches. Their energy was drained, and their bodies became weaker with each passing day. But it was not only their bodies that were under siege. Their minds, too, began to unravel. The constant isolation of Greenland, the unending stretches of snow and ice, the wind that never stopped howling, began to erode their mental clarity. There was no escape from the harsh environment. The landscape had become an oppressive force, one that they could not fight against or outlast. The Rangers could not ignore the ever-present reminder that they were in an alien world, far from help and far from civilization. As their physical endurance waned, their mental resilience began to crack. The days had no real distinction, no relief. They woke up to the same cold, the same tasks, the same bleak landscape. The sun, a pale sliver in the sky, offered no warmth, and the darkness of night seemed to stretch endlessly. In this world, time became a blur. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of rescue. The wait for something to change, for a break in the harsh conditions, became a mental burden. The strain of these endless days began to have more tangible effects on the Rangers. Some became withdrawn, their faces etched with fatigue. Others grew irritable, snapping at their comrades over the smallest issues. The emotional toll of the environment manifested in strange ways. Small, seemingly insignificant decisions began to feel monumental. The struggle to remain focused on the mission became increasingly difficult as the isolation pressed in. One of the most challenging aspects was the lack of any real communication. There was no contact with the outside world, no sense of progress, and no indication that the Rangers' efforts were anything more than a fight against time. Their mission, once clear and purposeful, now seemed distant and uncertain. The isolation was not just physical but psychological, and the mental strain was taking its toll on everyone. The Rangers had to rely on one another more than ever. Camaraderie, once a source of strength, now became a fragile thread that connected them to the outside world. The collective experience of survival was what kept them going, knowing that they were in this together, sharing the same hardships. But even this bond, strong as it was, could not shield them from the growing sense of despair. Sleep, which had been difficult from the start, became increasingly elusive. The Rangers would fall into fitful slumbers, their dreams often disturbed by the cold or the noise of the wind. Even when they could sleep, the rest was never truly restorative. Their bodies were exhausted, their minds were clouded, and the world outside their tents remained unchanged, unforgiving, cold and silent. The Rangers had not yet reached the breaking point, but they were teetering on the edge. Their physical and mental exhaustion was becoming harder to mask, and the pressure was building. The days that once seemed manageable now stretched out like an endless, unforgiving journey. The question of survival was no longer just about food or shelter. It was about whether they could maintain the will to continue. The environment, once a silent observer, had become the ultimate adversary, and it was clear that survival would be as much a mental struggle as a physical one. As the weeks passed, the hope of rescue became more and more distant. The Rangers had learned to survive, but there was a quiet recognition among them that their situation had grown dire. There was no immediate threat of death, no catastrophic event that forced them into panic mode, but the slow erosion of their bodies and minds continued relentlessly. They were stuck in a cycle, each day blending into the next, with no clear sign of when, or if, help would arrive. The cold, while ever present, was no longer the only enemy. The waiting had become a silent adversary, more insidious than any storm. In the beginning, the Rangers had been focused on completing their mission, setting up camp, and securing a presence in the region. Now, their mission was survival. They were not working towards a clear victory, but simply holding on, waiting for something to change. The days had become meaningless markers of survival, each one a small victory in an ongoing struggle that seemed to have no end. For some of the Rangers, the weight of the waiting had begun to manifest in small, subtle ways. They still performed their daily routines, maintaining the shelters, conserving food, and keeping their discipline intact. But there was no energy left for optimism. The hope for a break in the cold, the arrival of rescue, or even just a change in their circumstances seemed increasingly unlikely. The Rangers had become resigned to the harshness of their situation, their thoughts turning inward as the landscape around them remained unchanged. The food situation, though still managed with care, was growing more critical. The Rangers rationed their supplies meticulously, but the isolation had made it clear that they would not have enough to last forever. Their diet remained sparse and monotonous. Even the occasional successful hunt, though a welcome relief, was never enough to replenish what was needed. There was no more room for error. Every misstep, every small failure, now carried significant consequences. They were living on the edge, each meal a reminder of just how fragile their survival had become. Still, the Rangers pushed forward, day by day, in their silent wait. They would look up at the sky each morning, hoping for the appearance of a plane, a sign that their ordeal was nearing its end. But the sky remained empty, the sound of aircraft engines a distant memory. The Rangers had no idea how long they would remain in this frozen expanse, and the uncertainty weighed heavily on them. The concept of time had become irrelevant in the wilderness of Greenland. Days and weeks had no meaning beyond the act of survival. It was not just the physical strain that weighed on them. It was the mental toll of being so completely cut off from the world. The silence of the Arctic, broken only by the occasional whistling wind or the crunch of snow underfoot, became a constant reminder of their isolation. There were no sounds of human life, no signs of civilization, no connection to anything beyond their immediate surroundings. They had been sent to Greenland to carry out a mission, but now they were simply existing, waiting for something that seemed less and less likely with each passing day. In moments of quiet reflection, some of the rangers began to question their initial motivations. What had seemed like a clear objective, the establishment of a presence in Greenland, now seemed insignificant in the face of their ongoing struggle for survival. The mission was no longer about completing a task, but simply about holding on, about finding a way through the daily grind of the Arctic wilderness. Each new day brought only the certainty of more cold, more isolation, and the faintest hope that rescue might come soon. But even this hope, fragile as it was, had begun to fade. The rangers had long since ceased to believe that rescue was imminent. There were no updates, no word from the outside world. They had no way of knowing if anyone even knew they were in trouble. The cold, the wind, the snow, they were all they had now. And yet, despite everything, they continued. The hope for rescue, though dimming, still lingered in the back of their minds, the smallest spark of belief that help might one day arrive. In the silence of Greenland's endless white landscape, the rangers endured. There were no dramatic moments, no flashes of hope, only the slow, methodical passing of time. Their survival, in the end, would be defined not by their success in completing the mission, but by their ability to simply survive another day. And as the days passed, the rangers continued their waiting, knowing that they had little control over their fate. The vast, unforgiving terrain of Greenland stretched out in every direction, a landscape defined by snow and ice. A dark, unbroken expanse of tundra met the horizon where jagged mountain peaks cut through the sky. The wind howled across the surface, carrying with it the biting chill of a frozen world, where even the air seemed thick with the weight of isolation. The sun, a pale shadow in the sky, offered little warmth as it skimmed the horizon, casting long hollow shadows that stretched far beyond the land's edges. Greenland, for all its vastness and beauty, was a land of extremes. Here, the earth was scarred by glaciers that moved like slow rivers of ice, carving out deep fjords and valleys. The snow, deep and unyielding, covered the land in a blanket of white, turning every ridge and crevice into a potential hazard. The temperature in the winter months could plummet to dangerously low levels, and the wind, always present, cut through the environment like a blade. For anyone unprepared, this place was capable of swiftly erasing any trace of humanity, of rendering even the most determined of travelers invisible. For the men of the U.S. Army Rangers, this was their new home for the duration of their mission. They had been sent to Greenland, part of a larger strategic operation during World War II, with little more than their training and determination to rely on. Their mission, to set up a base of operations and gain a foothold in this isolated, frigid corner of the world, was vital to the war effort. They were told little else, their task being simple: survive the elements and execute their orders. Their arrival was marked by a muted sense of uncertainty. The Rangers unloaded from their transport aircraft, each one stepping out onto the cold, hard surface of Greenland with the quiet acknowledgement of the difficulty of what lay ahead. There were no signs of life, no welcoming party, no infrastructure to rely on, only the ice, the snow, and the endless expanse of land that seemed to go on forever. The Rangers, prepared for hardship, were already facing the first obstacle of their mission, the environment itself. With no immediate threats, they began their work, setting up tents, establishing a small outpost. Their equipment, though designed for rough conditions, was tested immediately by the extreme cold and the relentless winds. The landscape seemed indifferent to their efforts, the silence broken only by the occasional creaking of ice or the whistling wind. There was no shelter from the elements, only the harsh beauty of the land, both captivating and ominous in its solitude. The Rangers, isolated in this frozen world, had yet to understand the true severity of their situation. Though they were trained for survival, Nothing could fully prepare them for what the land would demand. The first days passed quietly, their focus on setting up a foothold, unknowingly embarking on what would become one of the most testing experiences of their lives. The survival of the U.S. Army Rangers in Greenland remains an understated testament to the power of endurance and the quiet resilience of the human spirit. In the isolation of the Arctic, far from the noise of battlefields and the expectations of a world at war, the Rangers learned that survival was not always a matter of dramatic events or heroic feats. Sometimes, it was simply about holding on, about enduring each day, and finding the strength to continue when the world around you seemed indifferent to your plight. In the end, their mission was not marked by any great victory or triumphant moment. It was not a success that would be celebrated with fanfare, nor a failure that would be remembered in history books. It was a struggle of persistence, of discipline, of simply surviving in a world where the elements were the greatest adversary. The conditions in Greenland were not kind, but they were revealing. They showed the Rangers, and perhaps the world, the true cost of survival in one of the harshest environments known to man. The mission, though far from complete, served as a harsh reminder of the value of resilience. It also highlighted the dangers of underestimating the power of the environment. Greenland had been a testing ground, not just for the Rangers' physical endurance, but for their ability to adapt, to wait, and to endure the mental toll of isolation. The time spent in that frozen wilderness, though a small chapter in the broader context of World War II, was one that defined the men who lived through it. As the Rangers were eventually rescued, their return was not marked by the fanfare that one might expect from a story of survival. There was no celebration, no dramatic reunion with loved ones, just a quiet acknowledgement of the ordeal they had endured and the survival they had achieved. The end of their mission in Greenland did not bring them back to a world that had been waiting for them. It simply returned them to a different reality, one where survival itself had become the ultimate victory. In a broader historical context, the survival of the Rangers in Greenland was but one of many untold stories of hardship and endurance. It was a reminder of the human capacity for adaptation in the face of extreme adversity. Yet, it was also a reminder of the risks taken, the lives that were changed forever, and the quiet toll that survival often exacts. For the Rangers who endured the harsh cold of Greenland, their survival did not bring relief, it brought reflection. They had faced not only the elements but their own limitations. The cost of survival was not always measured in food or shelter, but in the mental and emotional toll of the fight. The ordeal in Greenland was one of endurance, but it was also one of quiet realization that survival in its purest form is not about conquering the environment, but about enduring it. As the story fades into history, it leaves behind a quiet legacy of resilience and determination, an acknowledgement of the strength required to simply survive in a world that does not care whether you succeed or fail. The Rangers' time in Greenland remains a story not of triumph, but of quiet, steady endurance in the face of overwhelming adversity. And in that endurance, there is a profound lesson for all who seek to understand what it truly means to survive.